Elias Ward was leading his horse across the open land behind the cabin. He stopped in his tracks. Up ahead, an Apache woman was tied to a wooden post in the middle of the field, her arms pulled tight behind her back with coarse rope. Her shirt had been torn, revealing a body rippling with muscles, lean and strong like a warrior's, but now covered in blood and mud. Her cheek was swollen and bruised, her lips cracked and dry, and her neck bore the marks of a beating. At her feet, crude letters had been carved into a wooden plank. The shame of the tribe. Elias clenched his fists. This was not a punishment, this was a death sentence. No one could survive the desert sun left like this. He stepped forward without hesitation. One swift slice of his knife, and the rope snapped. Her large frame collapsed forward, and Elias caught her just in time. Her breathing was so faint he had to press his ear to her neck to realize she was still alive. "You are not going to die here," he whispered, his voice low and steady like an oath. The Texas sky burned red in the west as Elias lifted the stranger onto his horse, and deep in his chest rose a strange and unshakable feeling he could not quite explain. Elias's log cabin sat in the middle of the barren plains, surrounded by miles of sun-scorched earth and biting wind. He pushed the door open, breathing heavily from the long trek and the weight of the Apache woman in his arms. She was nearly unconscious, her large, solid frame now limp like a broken doll. He gently laid her on the bed, layering old blankets beneath her, then lit a fire in the stove. The flickering flames cast shadows across her bruised body, muscles clearly defined beneath her sun-darkened skin, the body of a warrior, treated like something disposable. Elias soaked a clean cloth in warm water and began wiping away the caked blood and dust from her face, careful as if he were touching something sacred. She did not wake. A soft moan escaped her lips as he applied salve to the torn skin on her wrists, raw from the ropes. In that moment, Elias realized just how fragile her life was, like a candle flame before the wind, yet it still burned, steady and stubborn, like the survival instinct of someone who had fought her whole life. Night fell. Outside, coyotes howled in the distance, and the wind hissed through the cracks in the cabin walls. Inside, only the soft crackle of the fire remained. Elias sat beside the bed, watching her face in the warm, flickering light. He did not know who she was or why anyone would do this to her. But he knew one thing for certain. No person deserved to die like that. Near midnight, the woman stirred. Her heavy eyelids opened, revealing deep black eyes wild. Terrified, she tried to sit up, but pain shot through her shoulder and she cried out, collapsing back onto the bed. "Easy," Elias said gently, his voice as soft as the breeze. "No one is going to hurt you now." She did not respond. She only stared at him with wary eyes, like a hunted animal that had narrowly escaped. Elias placed a bowl of water beside the bed, then stepped back to give her space. "You are free to leave whenever you want," he added, "but here, you will live." It was not meant to comfort her. It was a promise. She glanced at the bowl, then back at him. After a moment, her trembling hand reached out and scooped up a small sip. The water slid down her dry throat, and in that instant, the first thing to return was not her strength, but a fragile sense of trust that maybe, just maybe, the world had not entirely turned its back on her. Outside, the Texas sky gleamed under the moonlight, and in that lonely cabin, two strangers sat across from each other, one who had lost everything, the other abandoned by the world. And from that moment on, the journey of healing began slowly, but irreversibly. In the days that followed, Elias's cabin was no longer as quiet as it used to be. The sound of his hammer striking wood as he repaired the fence, the bubbling of soup she stirred silently, and the long stretches of silence between two people learning how to exist beside one another, all blended into a strange, unfamiliar rhythm. She never said her name. But Elias never asked. He simply called her Apache whenever he handed her a cup of water or a bundle of herbs, and she would only respond with a silent nod. Every night, she slept on the bed, and he took the porch. No words were spoken, but in that distance was a quiet kind of respect that needed no explanation. One morning, as Elias was latching the barn door, he saw her standing outside, arms wrapped around a massive bundle of hay so large that most men would have struggled to lift it. Her frame was tall, her shoulders broad, forearms taut beneath the morning sun, a sight unlike any woman Elias had ever known. "You do not have to do that," he said, surprised. "I have to," she replied, her voice low and rough, as if she had not spoken to anyone in a long time. "I cannot just eat and do nothing." It was the first time she had said more than 2 words to him. And from that moment on, the thin wall between them began to crack. That afternoon, as they carried timber together to build the fence, Elias asked quietly, "Why did they leave you like that?" She stayed silent for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was dry, like parched earth. "Because I was not like them. Women are supposed to be small, gentle. And I was not. They said I was born to hold a spear, not to bear children. They called me useless." Elias paused, his eyes softening. "And they tied you up for that?" "Not just tied me up," she said, a bitter laugh slipping out. "They hurt me, beat me, said I was a curse. They believed that if I disappeared, the men would stop being distracted." The wind swept across the plains, carrying with it the scent of scorched grass and a heavy silence. Elias said nothing more, only handed her the shovel. They kept working, but something between them had shifted. That night, as firelight flickered across the old wooden walls, Elias told her about his wife, how she had died giving birth, about the small grave he had built with his own hands behind the ranch, about the years he had lived like a ghost. They sat there for hours, not looking at each other, not touching, just letting their pasts flow out like water in the dark. And as the fire burned low, something changed. They were no longer strangers. They had begun to see themselves in one another, 2 souls the world had cast aside, now slowly learning how to trust and belong again. As the days passed, the cabin once filled with nothing but wind and dry grass now held the warmth of life. 2 people who once trusted no one had begun to share even the smallest moments. Elias woke earlier than usual, started the fire, and left coffee waiting on the table. She, whose name he now knew was Naola, had mended his worn-out coat by hand, each stitch oddly precise and careful. One morning, they went out together to cut hay. The wind whipped hard across the fields, sending Naola's long black hair flying behind her, while her strong arms pulled heavy bundles of grass with ease. Elias glanced over and gave a quiet chuckle. "You work harder than both of the men I used to hire, put together." "Because I used to fight to survive," she replied, then paused. "Back where I came from, the place I once called home, women like me were hated. But here it is useful." Her words made Elias stop for a moment. He looked at the woman beside him, powerful, proud, and with nothing left to hide. In that moment, he realized she was not just living here, she belonged here. That evening, the cold wind swept across the plains. Elias lit the fire in the stove, while Naola cooked her first stew since she had arrived. The cabin filled with the scent of meat and spices, a smell Elias had not known since the fateful night he buried his wife. As they sat across from each other, eating in silence, it was no longer the silence of distance, it was the silence of closeness. Naola set her spoon down and looked him in the eye. "Elias, I have never believed there was a place I could stay." "Maybe," he answered softly. "You never had someone who wanted you to." Their eyes met in the firelight. No other words were needed. An invisible thread had drawn them closer. That night, just as Elias was about to stand and put out the fire, Naola gently placed her hand on his. A soft touch, not urgent, not demanding as if she were asking, not taking. Elias did not pull his hand away. There was no passionate kiss, no hurried motion, just 2 people sitting beside each other, fingers intertwined, letting the warmth of the other sink slowly into their hearts. In the cabin's quiet darkness, they both understood. Trust, the thing they thought had died long ago, was beginning to live again. And for the first time in many years, Elias was no longer afraid of waking up alone. "I am truly grateful to have you here." If this story brought back memories of dusty afternoons, the sound of hooves echoing deep in your chest, consider subscribing to my channel, so that each day we can sit down together again, and I will tell you another tale from the West. The Texas sky burned red like molten iron as evening fell. The wind swept through, carrying dust and the fading echo of distant hoofbeats down the trail. Elias was splitting wood in front of the cabin when suddenly his horse reared back, letting out a loud whinny. From over the hill, 2 riders came galloping in, long coats flapping behind them, revolvers hanging loose at their sides. "Ward," one of them called out as they pulled up by the wooden fence. "We heard you're keeping a giant Apache woman in your house." Elias set down his axe and walked slowly toward the gate. The setting sun lit his weathered face, and in his gray eyes flickered a cold steel. "She is a guest," he said calmly. "And she has done nothing wrong." The second man snorted, spitting onto the dirt. "A guest. I call that trouble under your roof. That kind of woman was cast out by her own tribe, and now you bring her here? Looking for a fight?" Elias said nothing. He simply reached down and tightened the strap of the revolver at his side. The air grew thick. The wind stopped. Only the creak of the barn door moved in the silence. "Let me give you some advice, Ward," the taller man said. "You send that squaw packing before the townfolk come out here themselves. They do not like seeing her kind on white man's land." "She is not going anywhere," Elias replied, his voice low and firm as iron. "Because she is my wife." The 2 riders froze. For a moment, even the wind seemed to hold its breath. "Your wife?" One of them laughed, dry and sharp. "You say that like it means something. No one around here is going to accept something like her as your wife." Elias stepped forward, and the look in his eyes was enough to shut both men up. "I do not need your acceptance," he said, voice raised just enough to echo across the open land. "She stays here, and if anyone wants to lay a hand on her, they will have to go through me first." From inside the cabin, Naola stood quietly, watching. Elias's tall figure against the setting sun looked like a fortress, something she had never had in her entire life. The 2 riders exchanged a look. Then one of them gave a final sneer before yanking his reins. "You are going to regret this, Ward. The town will not let this slide." As they disappeared over the horizon, Elias stood completely still, his hand still wrapped tight around the grip of his revolver. Naola stepped out and stood beside him, saying nothing. They did not need words, both knew the truth. The real storm was only just beginning. Rumors traveled faster than the Texas wind. Within just a few days, from the saloon at the end of Main Street to the blacksmith shop down the hill, every story started with the name Ward and ended with the words "that Apache woman." Some folks sneered. Others spat as Elias walked through town. A few shops even refused to sell to him. But he never reacted, just quietly loaded his sacks of flour and rolls of wire into the wagon and headed back to the cabin. As if nothing had happened, Naola saw it all from the window. Every time Elias returned, his coat covered in dust. Something in his eyes grew a little heavier. She once told him she should leave, so he would not have to carry the burden. But when she said it, Elias gave a soft smile, one of the rare ones she had never seen before. "You are not a burden, Naola. You are the reason I remember I am still alive." From that day on, she stopped running. Every morning, she stepped outside to fetch water from the well, planted medicinal herbs near the barn, and taught the local children how to braid rope and track animals. Slowly, women from nearby farms started stopping by. They realized she was not the monster the rumors had painted, just a woman, stronger than any they had ever met. One afternoon, a child fell from a horse and broke his arm. It was Naola who carried him into the cabin, reset the bone, and wrapped it with herbs. His mother, the same woman who had once cursed Naola in the market now, stood silently by, tears brimming in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "I was wrong." From that moment on, the scornful glances began to fade. In their place came curiosity, then respect. People stopped by the cabin asking her to treat wounds on their horses, to show them how to make winter rations. And Elias, who had lived alone for 3 long years, now stood in his yard listening to laughter echo from the porch, feeling as if youth had returned to him. One crisp autumn morning, Elias rode into town to make a delivery. The blacksmith, the very man who had once shouted insults at him, stepped out of his shop, tossed him a bag of iron nails, and muttered, "No charge. Thank you for not giving up." Elias just nodded, not needing the thanks. He knew the real victory was not in forgiveness. It was in the fact that they had begun to see Naola as a person. That evening, as the sunset bathed the land in red, Elias rode back home, where Naola sat on the porch, her long black hair falling over strong shoulders. She looked up and smiled when she saw him in the distance. And for the first time in years, he understood this was no longer just a cabin. This was home. Spring came earlier than usual that year. On the land that once held nothing but red dust and wild grass, rows of tender green barley now stretched under the sunday. The wind carried the scent of wildflowers and the distant lowing of cattle, as if whispering a promise of new beginnings. Elias stood on the cabin porch, gazing out at the soil he and Naola had worked with their own hands. In his chest rose a feeling he had not known in years: hope. One afternoon, as the sun began to lean westward, Elias led Naola beneath the old cottonwood tree, the place where he had first found her, tied and left to die. A soft spring breeze stirred the fresh green leaves above, and gathered beneath them was a small group of townsfolk and children. No one said it out loud, but they all knew. This was more than a ceremony. It was the land itself asking for forgiveness. There was no priest, no diamond ring, no flowing white dress. Elias wore his old leather coat, and Naola draped herself in a deerskin dress she had sewn by hand. When he took her strong hand in his, standing before sky and soil, his vow rang out like thunder in the stillness. I once lived like a shadow after losing everything, until I found you. From this day on, nothing will tear us apart. Naola's dark eyes shimmered as she replied, and I vow that my strength will never again be a reason for isolation. From now on, it will be used to care for and protect this home. When Elias leaned up to kiss her forehead, cheers erupted from the small crowd. Children ran in circles, elders wiped away tears. And those who had once despised Naola now clapped without pause. All that had once been shame, every insult, every whisper was now pride. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Elias and Naola sat together by a small stream. She rested her head on his shoulder, her hand placed gently on her belly. Elias turned to her, his eyes lighting up with sudden understanding. "You," he whispered. Naola smiled, guiding his hand to rest over hers. "Yes, there is life growing here." No more words were needed. Elias wrapped her in his arms, holding her close. In that embrace, every loss, every judgment, every scar seemed to fade away. They were no longer two castaways. They were a family, and the child growing within her was the symbol of rebirth, written by the hands of fate itself. That summer, the land around Elias and Naola's cabin transformed so drastically that even they could hardly believe it. On soil once dismissed as dead, barley now stood heavy with grain. New stables rose from the earth, and lush green vegetable gardens bloomed under daily care. Where once only the wind whistled through broken fence posts, now came the sounds of hammers, cattle lowing, and children's laughter drifting from the porch. Their life was no longer shaped by loneliness or old wounds. Each morning, Elias woke early to feed the cattle, then helped Naola light the fire in the kitchen. She once cast aside had become the heart of the home, strong as she hauled firewood, gentle as she taught local children to bake and braid. Sometimes, Elias simply sat in silence, watching her from a distance, thinking to himself, "It was not me who saved her. She saved me from myself." One evening, as the sun dipped red behind the hills, Elias sat on the porch, running his hand over the smooth wood of the cradle he was carving. Naola stepped out, her figure steady like a bronze statue in the golden light, her hand resting on the curve of her belly. She sat beside him, saying nothing, simply watching. "I used to believe I would die alone on this land," Elias said softly, never lifting his eyes. "Now here I am, building a cradle for a child I never dreamed I would have." Naola smiled, that quiet, tender smile only those who have endured pain truly know. "And I," she replied, "used to think this body was a curse. But now, it carries life." No more words were needed. The evening wind swept through the fields, carrying the scent of hay and the soft clang of cowbells. In the distance, birds settled to the earth, wings flapping gently in the fading light. And in the middle of it all stood a home, not grand, not perfect, but warm as the hearts of the two people who once thought they would live and die in the dark. A few months later, beneath the old cottonwood tree where they had once made their vows, a child's cry rang out for the first time. Elias held his newborn son in his arms, his large hands trembling as if cradling the entire world. Naola watched through tear-filled eyes, the gaze of a woman no longer chained to her past. "We have walked through hell, Elias whispered. And now we have heaven. Right here, in the golden light of a Texas morning, the image of a man with his rifle resting by the door and a strong woman cradling a child in her arms stood as living proof that love can heal the deepest wounds, overcome the harshest judgment, and turn two lost souls into a family. And to you, my friend, in this land of dust and wind, where even the soul can be worn thin, love can still take root, even in the deepest wounds. It does not need to be grand. It does not need eternal promises. All it takes is someone brave enough to stay, brave enough to see the human behind the scars, brave enough to call someone the world has cast out family. Because in the end, love does not erase the past, it heals it. It transforms pain into strength and gives us a path to move forward, together. I wish you peace and happiness, wherever you may be. I love you all, my dear audience of Wild West storytelling. Let me know what you thought about this story. Leave a comment below. Type the number 1 if you enjoyed this story, and do not forget to subscribe to the channel for more dramatic Western tales to come.